Hi, Zach. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Doing fine. Thank you. Thank you for coming on the show. Actually, thank you for coming back on the show. You were on the audio podcast. I couldn't remember. You said 6 months ago?
Last September.
Was it
Yeah.
September? Okay. All right.
hmm
Well, welcome back. And you have a new book. Is this book part of the same series that we talked about last
It
time?
is.
Okay.
Yeah, it's the sequel to the first book,
Okay. And the title is.
Eternity's Mirror.
Now, I kind of forget what the series was about. Why don't you refresh my memory and tell us what this series is about?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Eternal Chronicles follows the story of Elior Barvadanya, um, a bastard prince who's friends with a disgraced Dorvan queen and a cursed merman. And in the first book, they sought out and found the Well of Eternity, a magical well that they drank from. The second book is them finding out how to fix their problems. Of course, in the first book, Opal was deposed from her throne, Nyx was cursed, and Elior lost his brother in a freak magitechnical explosion. And this is the continuation of that. It picks up right where the first book left off as they continue to look for solutions to get back, for Opal to get back on the throne, for Elior to find his brother, and for Nyx to find a way home.
Okay, why is he a bastard prince?
So his mother was unmarried when his father um, and her had a relationship, and of course was born out of wedlock. And the there are actually some details that would be a little bit of a giveaway for part of the book, but essentially, um, some of his mother's family did not approve of his father, and so sort of got in the way of that relationship becoming a marriage.
So his father was the king, presumably?
No, his mother was a
Was the queen?
princess.
Oh,
His father, as we revealed in the first book, um, is a political figure. He's not necessarily royal by any stretch, but he does play important political roles for Vidania, the country that they are from.
well, so how does he become a prince? That I'm confused on that part.
Well, he's a bastard prince, so he's still has the title by birth because his mother was a princess, and so genetically that's what he is, but he's not recognized by his family.
Okay, all right.
So he doesn't grow up in the palace. He gets the bare minimum recognition that, okay, he exists. He was Princess Emily's son, but that's it.
Okay, well, is there any significance to the fact of him being a bastard prince in relation to the story? I mean, does that play into the story?
It does, not as far as readers will know yet, but it does play a big role in later books.
Okay, all right. So I assume this series is going to continue. Do you have an idea of how many books this series is going to be, or do you just sort of keep writing and writing, and when you run out of ideas, then it's the end?
Right. I am not George Martin. I do have an end in mind. Um, yeah, so I am planning for the main series to have around a 5 book arc. If the third book, which I'm writing right now, ends up being way too long, it may turn into a 6 book arc. But right now, I'm happy shooting for 5. So yeah, I'm looking at finishing the third book by the end of April, at least the first draft, and that should be out at the end of the year.
Okay. Are you self-published or traditionally published, or?
So I actually own a publishing house. So it's
Oh,
I'm
okay.
self-published in that I own the publishing house that publishes my books.
Do you publish anybody else's books or just your own?
We are we actually accepted one submission other than my book so far, so we're starting to open that up. But it's of course it's slow because it's a new business.
All right, let me ask you something about that, if you don't mind, because
Of
I
course.
get a lot of authors on and a lot of aspiring authors and people that are listening to the show. What exactly would be the difference between just being a self-published author and an author who owns a publishing company? How is that different?
Okay, so the difference would be that I actually own an imprint. So instead of just my name that goes in the books, the name of my publishing house goes on there. And I work with a team of editors. I do a lot of outsourcing right now since it's still new. But essentially, I have a small indie press. Um, and so that's where the main difference is. My books are published through that imprint. Um, so I own the copyrights, but I own them through my publishing house. Whereas self-published authors that are purely self-published that don't own a publishing house or anything like that own all those copyrights themselves. So it's very similar to the same thing, except I'm making sure that I'm working with industry professionals to get designing done, to do formatting, to do editing. Some of those things I can do myself because I work in the industry and I'm about halfway through my own MFA, so I know industry standards a little bit better than someone who might just be entering into it, just wanting to write a book. I have edited at least one other book for a client so far. We're not publishing her book, but she is using my publishing house for her editing services.
Oh, I see. You do editing for other people?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, I guess that makes sense. So essentially, you're publishing under your company name rather than just as a sole proprietor, I guess.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Okay. Well, yeah. Okay. All right. I see that. I see the benefit to that. Tax-wise, that would be better, anyways, if
Yes,
you
it
start
means that I
selling
can be an
millions.
employee rather than
Exactly.
just
Yeah.
getting all that myself.
Yeah. Exactly. Let's talk a little bit about the book series. So, where did the concept for this whole thing come from?
That is such a great question. So, it came from a lot of different places. I really enjoyed the Lost Airbender or the Last Airbender and sort of this system of countries that were dependent on each other and balanced. And so some of that made it in. I loved the works of J.R. Tolkien in The Lord of the Rings, and some of that made it in. C.S. Lewis was a big inspiration for me. Christopher Paolini, The Secret Circle. So a lot of different things sort of gave me bits and pieces of the world in the Eternal Chronicles. And it sort of all came together as a mishmash and then became its own separate thing as I went about the pre-writing and world building process.
C.S. Lewis, was that the Narnia series?
Narnia. He also had a sci-fi series that I don't remember the name of off the top of my head, and he also had several nonfiction books, both in theology and philosophy and in medieval studies, because he was a medieval studies professor at Oxford.
Is your book set in that time period? Is it Middle Earth?
No. So I've done something a little bit different. I've enjoyed, of course, like medieval fantasy, but I felt like there was so much of that in the market. And then you have urban fantasy that's set in our world. And I wanted to find a balance between the two where it was still its own world, but it had modern technology and existed as if it was a world that wasn't strictly run by magic, where everyone was just content to live in the Dark Ages, just because someone could snap their fingers and turn on a light bulb or turn on a candle, I guess. So there are light bulbs and cell phones and high-speed trains and all sorts of things that we would be used to in our world, but they run a little bit differently because they don't have fossil fuels or things like that. So they have to run off of different forms of electricity and magical energy for the magic technology that's present in the world.
Well, so if somebody reads your book, are they going to assume it's into the future?
I don't know no,
No?
because there's definitely very stark differences between this and that world. Because of course there's a dwarf country, there's an elf country, there's a country full of jinn, which is a species inspired by Arabic myths and traditions. And there are mer people. So it's definitely not something that could be a futuristic society here. Um, also the world is not round. And I, as much as the flat earthers want to argue with that, I can't believe we have a resurgence of that. But Lux Terra is not a round world. It's a flat world that has two sides to it. So people live on both sides of the flat world in my books.
Well, that's an interesting concept. I had one of the flat earth guys on my show, and I keep an open mind, but when he came on and he explained this whole situation, there was nobody living on the other side. That's what was interesting. We're all on the top of it.
Right. Whereas
he called it the Antarctic Basin.
The Antarctic Basin. Okay.
I mean, it's a little out there, but it was entertaining and it was worth listening to, I thought, to get a perspective on other people's opinions. But the idea of living on both sides is sort of more interesting, because they would be upside down, wouldn't they?
There's still sort of a force similar to gravity, so it still keeps people pulled to what the surface would be, but it's not so much that they're upside down as it's as much upside down as Asia would be to us. They're clearly, their feet are facing our feet because they're on the other side of the planet, but they aren't necessarily upside down either.
I know this is kind of a silly conversation, but it reminds me of the old Bugs Bunny cartoons where he would dig his way to China, and he'd pop up and he'd be and everybody would be upside down. If you think about in space, because there really is no up, down, left, right, that when you see them floating around, there's no perspective which way's up.
Right. And it changes depending on where you are, the perspective.
Yeah. In fact, in order for them to simulate gravity, they have to have something that's going around in a circle, right? Centrifugal force. You could be upside down and not know it. I think
that's
basically.
True.
All right. Well, let's move on from upside down. So this book is out now?
It is. It came out about 10 days ago.
Okay. How's your book series doing generally?
Anyone who has bought it and done me the courtesy of leaving a review has left favorable reviews. My publicist has great pleasure in describing me as the critically acclaimed author Zachary Hagen, which I love. I can't wait till we see a best-selling on some part of that. It's well received. At this point, it's just a matter of figuring out how to get it into more hands, I think.
That's the big challenge with the oversaturated internet market.
Yes. And of course, the traditional publishing world puts out thousands of books every year, not all in the fantasy genre, but it does put out a lot. And then you have self-publishing authors putting out books every year, and usually a little bit faster than traditionally published authors. And then you have indie authors that are somewhere in between, of course, where it takes longer than a month to get something out, but not as much as maybe 5 years sometimes for the traditional circuit, where they're waiting for the market to need that book. It's about finding the audience. And I think that I started out thinking that I would be a YA author, and that's how I wrote the book, the first book. But I've noticed that the people who have really enjoyed it have been a little bit older. They've been closer to my age, or maybe in their 30s or 40s. And I think that that's, to me, that says that I was focusing on the wrong demographic for the first book. And so I've changed my tactics. I've changed how I'm writing the books. It's still appropriate for younger audience, but I'm not necessarily writing specifically for them anymore, I think.
Well, I think on that note, we need to wrap this up. Thanks so much for coming on. Do you have a website that you want to give out, your publishing or personal one?
Yeah, so Zachary Hagen Writes is currently the website where I host everything from my publishing services to my own books. So that is where everyone can go. My social media links are all there as well.
Okay, ZacharyHagenWrites.com. Okay, great. Well, thanks for coming back on. Nice seeing you, and best of luck. I hope this gets to bestseller. What do you have to? Is there a number mark to get to bestseller, or is it just Like a million
Some of it's
copies, or
numbers.
you know what I mean?
Yeah, some of it's numbers and some of it is campaigning. Like getting on the New York Times bestseller list probably will not happen for me unless I go with a larger publisher than my own imprint. But it's possible to get on the US Today bestsellers list because they look more at numbers than content and numbers. So I think it's something like 1,500 sales in a day is what they want to see
Oh,
to make
okay.
it to the bestsellers list for 1 week.
Well, that seems approachable. You know, I mean, a platinum album
Mhm.
is a million sales.
Right,
That's harder to
right.
get to.
What's what's harder is sticking to that bestsellers list for more than a week because you only
Yeah,
need to hit that sales mark once in a week to get there, but you need sustained sales to move past it. So um, you tend to see better sales the longer a series is around because people like to binge read just like they like to binge watch.
that makes